Hey everybody, so welcome to the second developer diary for the Archon Prophecy expansion for Age of Wonders 4. This will be the Architects Part 2. If you somehow managed to click on this video without actually understanding anything, I would recommend you watch the first part of this video, which I uploaded last week. But if you're stubborn and you want to watch anyway, a developer diary is something that developers put out once a week that goes over some brief details of the game to try to build up some hype. Age of Wonders 4 is this game, and the Archon Prophecies are upcoming fairly large expansion. In the first video, it went over the architects. This is a new culture. So cultures in Age of Wonders 4 have 6 units, 5 combat units, and a scout. They generally have some sort of buff, a theme going on. You can obviously combo a culture with any number of tomes, any number of racial traits, different ruler types, etc., etc. But each culture is generally the largest gameplay difference between how your different factions will play. So, for example, you could end up with very similar feudal plus dark factions, right? So like one person could go feudal, one person could go dark, and they could end up sort of being similar, but compared to anything else, cultures change your faction the most. So the architects, as we went over in the first video, are trying to be very much a late game faction that builds up and eventually gets so many buffs that they seemingly just sort of win. They really want to go tall and build these monuments, and they've talked about how the monuments will of course buff their units with their Affinity incarnate. That's generally how they're going to try to scale. So here in this developer diary, they're going to go over the units that the faction is going to use to try to win. So here we have the architect units. The architect units each have a slight twist on their role, providing off-role utility that gives them unique uses. In addition, these units often gain additional benefits from Affinity Incarnate, meaning they remain relevant into the late game so as long as enough monuments are built. So one common complaint I think that a lot of people have is that because cultural units don't tend to have tier 4, there is one cultural tier 4 unit, but it's sparse and difficult to mass that much. Because culture doesn't have a tier 4 unit, often each culture by tier 4 will be spamming the same tier 4 units that everybody has access to through their tomes. So a lot of people have asked for cultural units to scale a bit better so that the different cultures in the hyper late game will kind of merge together into using the same kind of units, right? And that seems to be, I did read through this, obviously. This is not like a first reaction. I make sure to read through all this stuff so that you guys aren't just watching me sit here and go, huh? What's that mean, right? But the architect units, they very much do seem to want them to be more of a scaling unit that you could definitely use into the late game. Whether or not that will be successful, I guess we'll see. My guess is probably better scaling than other factions, but not quite enough that you'd really want to use them in the late game to any real extent, right? But let's talk about it. Architect units adapt based on the dominant affinity of the Empire, both visually and in their damage type. Now that is something you talked about in the last dev diary. The more affinity you have, so of course you can have the affinity for I think the 6 different elemental types. Was it chaos, astral, shadow, order, nature, and chaos. Did I say chaos already? Maybe I did. I don't know. Materium. Oh, there we go. Materium. So we'll see what they're going to go with that, but I guess the general idea is based on your dominant affinity, all your units will change into dealing that kind of damage, which, okay, you get the general idea, right? The units adapt their non-physical damage based to their dominant affinity, highest Empire affinity, letting you lean to builds that make extended use of a specific damage type, such as going full astral lightning and inflicting lots of lightning weakness. So, I mean, that's a pretty common build in the game right now. For those of you guys who maybe haven't played Age of Wonders 4, lightning damage builds are pretty common into the late game. That's an elemental type that is very supported. Fire builds are not very supported. They can struggle a bit. Spirit builds don't have any support. There is support for builds that would happen to use spirit damage, but there's no like, let's make spirit damage better, right? There is small support for No, I think it's really actually, I mean, realistically, it's only lightning you can really emphasize that much. There is some support for all the different damage types, but I would say lightning is definitely the most supported. There is some kind of fire build, but they can struggle late game for one various reason or another. But at any rate, maybe this expansion will allow you to support more damage types, but for now, lightning is the most commonly supported because it just has the most support for it. Aesthetically, each architect unit wields an enchanted item I will refer to as their artisan item. These represent the ancient craftsmanship and enchantment techniques that the architects still use to great effect. So I do believe they're just talking about a buff. As I was reading through here, there's obviously not gonna be like an item you equip to your regular units. They seem to be using a bit of a fancy wording here, but they just mean that each of these units are just using some sort of like let's say lore item, but it's actual gameplay impact. You're not equipping items onto them. I do not believe so. So this is their scout unit, the Surveyor. Architect cultures seek Wonderstone to build their monuments, blah, 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 blah. There's a lot of paragraphs, but I'm just going to generally summarize this for you guys. If you've played Age of Wonders 4 and you've played the industrial culture, you know that you send your scouts out into the world, and industrial culture has a unique benefit to their scouts where they can survey for more resources, or I think it's called survey. It's called something, right? So their scouts can scout the map really hard, but then if you have more than one scout, 2, 3, or even 4 scouts, you can continue to effectively mine mountains with them, which can be a lot of extra resource bonuses that your empire can accrue throughout the early game. So the Surveyor unit has a similar mechanic here, where if he goes out and he finds magic material, you see, they can scout the map for magic materials and survey those provinces to get an early supply of valuable Wonderstone. So they kind of recommend you go maybe 2 or 3 scouts in the early game because you want to get them onto magic materials out in the world, and presumably you might want to be the first one there. They didn't say if there's multiple architect players, are they competing to get the Wonderstone or not? But anyway, that Wonderstone is how they build their monuments. And you don't only generate them from surveying magic materials, but it is a good source for it in the early game. So they just sort of go like that. Overall, it doesn't seem to be that fantastical for a scout unit. It does seem to have optional cavalry here, despite the fact that they run normally. So it is a scout that isn't on a mount. This only gives him 40 movement speed. Generally speaking, he's not really... I mean, scouts in this game tend to not really be that... I mean, they're scouts, right? Like, you scout with them. This is not exactly where they're putting in all their differences, right? Age of Wonders 4, each of the different units in the game tend to be very, very, very different from each other. So even if you have a shield unit and another shield unit, and they're both even tier 1, they might each have unique defining features that separate them and separate how you'd want to use them and separate how you want to play against them, because they've got these defining features about them that are differentiated. So the Cultivator here, for example, the architects have a tier 1 support and a tier 3 support. We'll get into that one later, but most cultures have a tier 2 support. The way they talk about the Cultivator here, and I'll go into the abilities in a second, but the main advantage of the Cultivator is that you can build a support unit at tier 1. All the other cultures need to get to tier 2 to do it, meaning upgrading their capital. That's not something you really do in the early game, and that's something you do more in the mid game. And once you get tier 2, you kind of just sprint into tier 3. So tier 2 supports, you will get them, but it's not as... you can't really get them in the early game, right? So as I phrase it here, the Cultivator is a core unit to Architect Cultures, a tier 1 support unit that links to a friendly unit to empower them during battle. Being only the second tier 1 support in the game, the other being the Letherian core from the Giant Kings, and the first cultural tier 1 support, the Cultivator is in a unique position of availability and ubiquity compared to other culture support units, especially in the early game. Ubiquity. That is something I've not had to say out loud a lot. The main purpose of the Cultivator is to provide Affinity Incarnate. This is done through their primary ability, which links to the target friendly unit and grants them stacks of Affinity Incarnate. The type of Affinity Incarnate given depends on the culture's dominant affinity. Thus, if we have a predominantly Chaos Affinity Empire, this link will provide Chaos Incarnate. So, of course, the Chaos Incarnate, what you're talking about, you get that from Wonders, but another way to do it in battle is to get a stacking, as they call it, stacking. I don't know if it actually stacks or not. Like per turn, does it continue to ramp up or not? They didn't say, but they use the word stacking here. is to provide ability. Yeah. Yeah, you get some stacks of affinity incarnate. Now, that probably just means it gives them like a flat amount instead of stacking up each turn. If I had to guess, that would be it, right? So, of course, they buff up their allies. Affinity incarnate baseline gives a unit more damage, a good chunk of more damage. So there's a support unit that can be used to buff up other units by linking towards them. And as we go down and we start looking at the other units, each of these different units does get a buff directly from the Affinity Incarnate. So normally, a normal unit will only get more damage, but the cultural units from the Architects will get more than just more damage, as they'll explain down here. So in addition, this link gives a weak but steady source of healing each turn, and perhaps more notably grants a dispel of a single negative status effect each turn, insulating the cultivator's target from the limited debuffs. The primary attack of the cultivator inflicts status effect weakness, setting the target up for more inflicting burning, electrified, frozen, or other powerful status effects you may build into. The cultivator combines extremely well with units that are expected to take hits, such as the next one on the list, the Earthbreaker. So this is just a cheap throwaway tier 1 support unit. You link it with a more powerful unit. You'll probably throw 1 into each stack, 2 at tops, but you kind of have to remember that, let's say we have 3 frontliners and 2 supports, and these supports are making them maybe 50% stronger, then we'd actually end up with 3 frontliners, 2 of them 50% stronger. We'd end up with 4 effective frontliners, right? But if we have 4 frontliners plus a support, that gives us 4.5 effective frontliners. So especially if we have these wide open maps, supports can only do so much unless they're like literally doubling the effect of the unit that they're supporting. It's not going to be great, right? So probably 1 to 2 supports in your army. Again, it depends on the map, depends on choke points. You can't always get 4 units on the front line into a fight. And it also depends on if your hero is also trying to be on the front line or if he's trying to support as well. But yeah, I would generally say you'll probably want about 2 of these guys, one or 2 of these guys in a stack. And then you just link to whoever's going to be on the front line. And of course, I think, as they say, it also seems like it could be really good if you're doing like a warrior hero or a giant king or a dragon or something like that, that you could have this guy just buffing that dude up throughout the entire early game, so then he could just try to carry your battles to a win. So it does seem like it's just a pretty solid tier 1 unit. Tier 1 units aren't really meant to be played into the late game. They're meant more to be a very specific type of unit in the early game. Something that does a very specific role that you can use, and then eventually gets outscaled. But yeah, I mean, they buff up other units, presumably the Earthbreaker, as they say. The Earthbreaker forms a frontline of many early game Architect armies, a tough tier 1 shock unit that can provide disruption with a decent chance to survive the encounter. So there are shock units, support units, shockingly support, and shock units, shockingly shock. The general idea is the farther they travel, up to 3 hexes before they attack, they deal more damage. That's every shock unit has that. They also remove retaliation strikes, they remove defensive stance. The general idea is to run in, do a bunch of damage on their first hit, and then after that, hopefully survive. If they don't survive, oh well, but that's generally what shock units do, right? Run in, deal a lot of damage, and also catch and chase down range units, because range units will tend to be longer range from you, right? So they can run that distance to get the full damage bonus and crush them. They do decent into shield units, but everything does good into shield units right now. Unless this expansion changes, shield units are blatantly the weakest unit in the game. The Earthbreaker has a sweeping charge attack, letting it disrupt defensive formations and effectively fight a more numerous foe. After using its charge, the Earthbreaker enters defense mode, which greatly boosts its survivability against anything but a dedicated countercharge. Now, I'm interested into this because I read through here and there doesn't seem to be any drawback to that. Defensive mode is quite strong, and being able to enter defensive mode each time you attack is also pretty strong. This unit's stats seem to just be a very typical 2-0. 2 defense, 0 resistance. So being able to enter defensive mode after every attack would make it quite tanky. The Oathsworn unit, the Honor Blade, can enter defensive mode, I think once every 2 or maybe 3 turns after attacking, and that's considered quite strong and makes it quite difficult for enemies to deal with. This guy potentially being able to do it every single turn is interesting. In addition to that, the base stats we're seeing here, we do have Sundering Blade, so this is an early game, and I don't want to read into these numbers too much, but this looks like a very tanky tier 1 unit. Additionally, the Earthbreaker gains more survivability into the late game thanks to its passive Incarnate Fortitude. This grants it additional max HP for each stack of Affinity Incarnate on this unit. One might see why the Earthbreaker is an excellent partner for the Cultivator to link with. This survivability and AoE utility comes at a cost. The Earthbreaker deals significantly less damage than other shock units do, and the secondary targets of a sweeping charge only take 20% of that damage. This means that an Architect culture will need to seek out effective damage dealers early on, either in their tier 2 units or through tomes. So the damage seems fine to me, and especially for a tier 1 unit, that seems like a pretty decent damage, of course. But we don't really have the full picture here, and we don't know where this screenshot was taken from, so I'm going to take that with a grain of salt. The Cultivator, I mean, we're looking here at 50 HP, optional cavalry. 14 damage is pretty good, but overall, I mean, this guy seems like his stats are pretty much in order. This guy's stats are pretty solid for a tier 1 unit. They say he does low damage, but I sure don't see that. At any rate, it does look like a cool unit. It does look like a unit that you could keep it around in your armies, and you wouldn't want to delete it later in the game because it's going to get more health. Affinity Incarnate also just, increasing its damage a lot, so we'll see what happens here. Yeah, I do see Materium Incarnate. This one has Affinity Incarnate. This one has Materium Incarnate. Incarnate Fortitude. Incarnate Fortitude is different than Materium Incarnate. Materium does look like it gives physical damage. I think Materium will give physical damage. We'll see, though. So this brings us to the Shademaker. This is an archer. Tier 2 archer, so they've got tier 1 shock unit, tier 1 support unit, tier 2 archer. We're going to look at 5 units, so this is a third unit. The Shademaker is a powerful tier 2 ranged damage dealer. Using their Titan Bros, they bring down any monster that threaten the Architect's project. So of course the Titan Bow was added in the last expansion as a hero item, and it looks like every one of these units are going to do it. So I will give it Giant Slayer. It doesn't seem to show up in the stats here, but that will give it Giant Slayer, which means against large targets, it will deal more damage. Uniquely, the Shademaker's Titan Bro has Giant Slayer, as I just said, letting them deal with the largest targets and partially fulfill the role of a polearm for the Architects. In addition, half of the damage type of their primary attack is determined by the dominant affinity. Thus, should you be an astro-focused ruler who inflicts lots of lightning weakness, the Shademaker will play into this naturally. Now, I'm hoping they're not relying entirely on everybody going lightning damage. Hopefully they add support for other elements. Yes, lightning is supported. Yes, lightning builds are pretty common, but at the same time, other builds, should maybe be a bit more common as well, perhaps supported a bit more. I hope they're just not relying on everyone going astral and going lightning damage. Fire is almost supported, but not quite. And the other elementals, definitely, they're drowning at the bottom of the pool, right? So they could use some support, either through tombs or spells or something like that, that helps them play a bit stronger. The Shademaker also has a powerful means of subduing attackers in the Incarnate Shot, an AoE ranged attack that gains a chance to inflict weakened for every stack of Infinity Incarnate the Shademaker has. Gains a chance to inflict weaken for every stack. So I'm wondering if is that one big chance to inflict, like, let's say 4 stacks of weakened, or is it 4 different times? Because the way they word it seems a little bit feast or famine. So let's say we have a 50% chance to apply weakened. If we do that 4 times in a row, it makes it a bit consistent. But let's say we have a 50% chance to apply 4 times weakened. Well, it's either going to hit or it's not going to hit, right? Now, weakened, of course, reduces the damage an enemy deals. So Incarnate Shot will reduce the enemy's damage. So it seems to very much be a tanky culture that would want to play with a more tanky playstyle. They seem to be very similar to Industrialists. They're basically the sister of Industrious here, at least in how they're going to play from what I've seen so far. So Industrious has a powerful support unit, a powerful tanky unit, and then a pretty powerful ranged unit. The Arbalist recently got buffed. He's a bit tankier now, which makes him far more playable. And that seems to be kind of the idea we have here, with the Shademaker being our damage unit, and then us having the tanky front line and then the support. And even though this is a tier 2 unit, you could probably start with 2 of these fairly consistently by going Fabled Hunters. There's a second Archer, and then we're always going to start with 1 tier 1 unit one tier 2 unit in our armies at game start, so we could start the game with 2 Shademakers, and so long as they don't die, that should allow us to get enough range damage for our formation pretty much throughout the game. Yeah. Shademaker's function as a culture's primary damage dealers, while providing a way to soften the impact of massed enemies and thin their numbers through incarnate shot. So yeah, it's just AoE damage debuff. They very much want to sit in a formation and just AoE enemies while being tanky themselves. Yeah. They're soft targets once engaged in melee, however, so keep the enemy disrupted with your Earthbreakers and ensure you bring a front line that can tank a hit, such as our next unit, the Guardian. So here's a Guardian. Now that's a shield unit, but it's using a spear. Shield unit using a spear. So it is being counted as a shield unit, but it is getting effects as if it's a shield unit, but it has half the effects of a polearm unit. So yeah, the Guardian will be your anvil. While Earthbreakers provide disruption, this tier 2 shield unit provides a tough frontline brawler of the Architect culture, designed to be tough above all else while withering away at adjacent enemies and leaving them vulnerable to their ally strikes. The Guardian's basic attack does a low damage for a tier 2 shield unit. Shield units already do low damage, which has been causing them issues in viability. This one does even lower damage, coming down to 10, which there's a tier 2 unit doing tier 1 damage, so we'll see what happens with that. Yeah. But it has access to first strike, so it does have the access to the first strike that normally polearm units would get. Their relatively low attack damage is offset by 2 powerful passive effects, however. The first is Incarnate Disruption, which reduces the damage resistant of enemy adjacent... reduces the damage resistant of adjacent enemy units per stack of Affinity Incarnate the Guardian has. The damage resistant reduced is based on the stacks of Affinity Incarnate. Thus, the Guardian should have should the Guardian have one each of Astral Incarnate and Chaos Incarnate, adjacent enemies will suffer -1 lightning and -1 fire resist. Okay. Effectively, if we have 3 Chaos Incarnate, adjacent enemies get -3 fire resist. If we have 3 Astral Incarnate, enemies get -1 lightning resist. General idea, you stack the Incarnate Elemental that you want to deal its damage. So if we want to deal lightning damage, stack Astral. If we want to do fire damage, stack Chaos. Now this is a tier 2 unit. It is a tier 2 shield unit. Shield units are pretty notorious for becoming really bad in the late game as enemies start doing mass elemental damage. Their shield just generally doesn't do that much, and combined with their low damage on the unit itself, they tend to sit on the battlefield and not really do that much. So we'll see what happens with them. But their last effect here is the second is Incarnate Retaliation, forcing attackers to take damage based on the stacks of Affinity Incarnate and the Guardian. This damage may not seem like a lot, but it can quickly escalate to significantly more painful numbers, especially with some assistant like the Cultivator. So its general idea is it sits on the front line. Enemies try to attack it. They take damage back. Effectively, it hits thorns. It reduces enemies' resistance. Seems good in theory. It's much like the Spear unit from Industrious Tier 2, in that the Spear unit from Industrious Tier 2 deals damage back to enemies when it takes damage. This is the same thing. This is trying to be a quasi-Spear shield unit, so it's definitely taking cues from Industrious here. But the problem that seems pretty obvious is that with such outrageously low damage, I highly suspect most enemies will just walk right past him, ignore him, and not acknowledge his existence. Which, yeah, I mean, I guess the general idea is you maybe have 1 or 2 in your stacks. Maybe like each stack has like 1 of these guys. You run them into the middle of the enemy formation, debuffing their resistances. Then you hit them with a lightning AoE or something like that. But I guess the question is then, like, wouldn't it be better to just have more damage? I guess they're tanky, so the general idea is they'll be tanky. But I'm looking at their stats, and they're really not that tanky. If you exclude their shield, they have 80 HP, which is average for a tier 2. Could be a bit better, because it is a shield unit with very low damage, but it's 80 HP, 2 defense, 3 resistance. So it's good to have a shield unit with high resistance, but that's only still 2 defense. If you attack him from the other side of his shield, he's about as tanky as a tier 1 unit. In fact, he's exactly as tanky as a tier 1 unit. So, not that great. Yeah. But they do have the thorns. If you can manage to get an enemy to try to attack you, either through you just being in the way or physically blocking their path, then the thorns will of course be quite frustrating for enemies to deal with. So their tier 3 unit is another support unit. So I have a tier 1 support unit and tier 3 support unit. Highly assume then that architects will be based on bringing in a unit from tomes. So be it a Pyre Templar, be it a Stormbringer, it's going to be a Stormbringer. They'll bring in these units from tomes and then support them with their roster, be it a tier 1 support unit or a tier 3 support unit. I suspect you'll bring in maybe like a battle mage to use this stuff, or again you'll just go Stormbringer, or you could maybe try to do Pyre Templar, reduce enemies' fire resistance, bring in a Pyre Templar, stuff like that. Seems to be the general idea. But the architect himself then, and now for the tier 3, often the defining unit of a culture, the architect is a tier 3 support unit. However, it feels a very different role to its tier 1 colleague. Man, I just cannot pronounce words today. The architect is a simple but powerful support capable of providing distraction and damage through their Conjure Affinity Tesseract ability, which lets them summon a stationary structure in combat that flings magic damage towards the enemy and provides an alternative target. So the other support that could summon stuff comes from, what is it? It's the mage culture. Why can't I think of their name? It's the... You know what I mean, the mage culture. Wow, I can't think of his name. The summoner. I know he's called the summoner, and he can summon. He's a tier 3 summon, or sorry, tier 3 support, and he summons as a tier 3 support, and it summons. So summoning is quite a powerful effect. Man, why can't I think of their name? I'm gonna go crazy. I'll move past it. My brain is farting out on me right now. At any rate, the summoner has always already been a powerful unit, and this guy looks to be pretty powerful on his own. Now, his stats are not that amazing. He's an optional cavalry, 80 HP, 2 defense, 2 resistance. Support units tend to actually have higher resistance, so being down here at 2 is not great. This makes him pretty squishy, even for a support unit. So, he can summon. The summon will have more HP. It will do damage. It will bring more action economy into the battle, if you want to call it that, but in return, he himself is a pretty squishy dude, but he does have that 20 damage nuke. We don't know if it'll actually be 20 damage though. He could already have many stacks of elemental affinity, so I'm not going to look at that too hard, but we are going to look at these base stats. Pretty squishy dude, but he does get a pretty good summon. Okay. Clever architect players might even conjure the Tesseract in choke points to buy time for the range units to do damage or protect vulnerable support elements. The damage type of the Tesseract is based on the dominant affinity. But what makes the architect a true powerhouse of a tier 3 support is incarnate restoration. So I'm going to save you a whole paragraph here. It has a heal, and that heal scales based on your affinity incarnate. This will make it the only scaling heal in the entire game. In fact, I don't think any other heal scales. And this will allow him to be a tier 3 support that actually scales into late game. All other supports tend to be tier 2. There's a couple tier 3 in the game, but they're So this is a cultural, so I should say a racial tier 3 support unit. Very interesting that, because most of the time support units tend to be tier 2, which means they just get outscaled. No matter how much you like them, no matter how much you want to use them, at the end of the day, you can only have so many units in a battle, and even if that unit is like a really efficient tier 2 unit, it's just not going to be a tier 4 unit. But a really efficient tier 3 unit could probably perform on par with a tier 4 unit, right? Okay. This ability quickly becomes the most powerful single target heal available, making architects an excellent support for powerful dragon or giant rulers, or any other linchpin unit with a healthy pool of HP. Now, of course, if any developer just happens to be listening to me for some reason, I do think supports suffer from something where they take an entire research to get a support ability, then that support ability maybe affects 1 unit per stack. Whereas if I just get lightning blades, that just buffs every melee unit's attacks. If I get a buff for a battle mage, I could potentially just have all my units be battle mages getting buffed. So I do think support units need a little bit of help scaling. I do think overall the tomes that buff support units actually need to be stronger, because if you're buffing so few units in your armies, you definitely want those buffs to be stronger, because the effect of getting one support unit buffed is just going to have to equal about the effect of getting 3 melee units buffed, because you're going to have one support unit for 3 melee units, or 3 whatever unit type you have, right? You get the idea. Lastly, should these abilities be unavailable, its basic blast attack gives it a decent way to contribute to a fight still, inflicting sundered resistance and defense. Now, that is strong to sunder resistance and defense, and do remember sundering defense and resistance, of course, also reduces their status resist. Increasing your defense and resistance doesn't increase your status resist, but reducing it does reduce their defense, or say reducing it does reduce their status resist. Words are hard. So at any rate, being able to debuff an enemy twice on one attack and give them -2 status resist, that is pretty good. In addition, of course, you're reducing their armor and their resistance, so that's good too. Well, the Architects are not a particularly cavalry-focused culture. Both the Architect and Cultivator, God, I'm like getting worse as time goes on. Cultivator may optionally have mounts should you choose to bring any mount traits. This gives you access to quite capable and extremely mobile support units. So I think the idea here from this perspective is you could get a mount trait on your race. It's only going to buff your supports, but if you can find some tome units that have optional cavalry or are already mounted, then you could maybe support those units. So for example, hypothetically, we could look at like a Tyrant Knight. If they do buff Tyrant Knights, we could look at Tyrant Knights because they're on a mount. So we'd be buffing Tyrant Knights with these Architect units, and then they'd all be mounted, so stacks would move really quickly. It would be pretty strong for that perspective. They don't really seem to want to be pushing you to use cavalry with this culture. If you want to use it, great. If you don't want to use it, great. They're not really trying to do a cavalry focus. Feudal got reworked, and Feudal was super heavy cavalry focused. And for this culture, they're not going cavalry focused, which is fine. Like, not every culture needs to have like a super viable cavalry build, right? Okay. Research. The Architect culture, like old cultures, has 3 research skills available to it. Incarnate Mark just applies the ability to buff your old non-Architect units with Affinity Incarnate. Old cultures have some sort of thing like that, where they can apply their culture's buffs to other units that they would get from a tome or from wonders or stuff like that. It's just like that. You research it, you slap it on units, ta-da, great. Okay, now everybody gets buffed from Affinity Incarnate. Conjure Elemental. Now this one's interesting because I'm sure if you've looked at a lot of my videos, this is now the second culture that is getting the ability to summon units without the need of a tome. Conjure Elemental is a tactical summon spell that lets you summon a lesser elemental spirit based on your dominant affinity. Blah, 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 blah. Now, Feudal could technically summon, but not summon. They would recruit militia, but they would use a spell resource to do it. So, Feudal could get a lot of units onto the field, and they wouldn't be as reliant on using tomes to get summons, which, allowed them to do different builds maybe a little bit more. This one is a second culture that is also getting a summon without needing a tome, which will allow them to also diversify their first tome choices a little bit, because right now you need a summon on your first tome. It's the meta way to play. It's just so much stronger than not having a summon, and the devs have given every early game tome does have a summon attached to it, but this does mean that if you don't want to just go for those obvious early game tomes, if you want to try to do something different, this does give you the ability to have a summon while trying to do a different build. So I think that allows a lot more build diversity, just giving people a tool. It also means you don't need to research it on your own, and it also means you'll always have some sort of elemental of your damage type. If I'm trying to do a fire build, I can have this Conjure Elemental giving me an early fire elemental, or as I call it, Magma Spirit, so that I have some sort of fire output going on there. No matter what I'm doing, I'm always going to have some sort of elemental type of my type being dealt to enemies. Resilient Incarnation is a tactical buff spell, letting you significantly increase the defense and resist of a vulnerable formation of friendly units. Units in a 1-hex AoE gain resistance and defense, which increases with each stack of element Affinity Incarnate that they have. Now, of course, you are capped as to how much you can stack You're only allowed to go to bolster resistance 5, bolster defense 5. So there is a cap to this unless they're doing it based on a different system, which wouldn't make sense. But unless they were doing it on a different system, this does mean you can only get 5 resistance, 5 defense, and an AoE, and it should use the buff that's already in the game. It's not blowing my mind, I guess is what I can say. I definitely don't think that this will get used very often. Maybe sometimes if you're like in an actual phalanx and you're just trying to tank right through enemies, I could see it maybe being used. To get early game, I'd wager, what, maybe like 3 defense, 3 resist, something like that. So it's not really that amazing of a spell. It's not really anything to look at. It's okay, I guess. I hope this proved to be an interesting insight into the new architect culture, blah, 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 blah. So let's recap that real quick. They're the only culture with a tier 1 support unit. The tier 1 support unit looks, again, I said it's not looking like it's going to blow my mind. It's not looking like the most amazing support unit ever, but it goes in the back line. It supports your front line. It gives them damage boost. It gives them some healing, so there's nothing bad about that. And then it reduces enemy status resist, and at 14 damage per attack, it can reposition an attack pretty good. So I think that this is a perfectly fine, perfectly viable unit. You're obviously going to replace with the architect later as designed, but you know, it's a perfectly fine unit, especially if you're trying to do a hero build. I think with like a melee focused hero, there's a great support for that sort of thing. The Earthbreaker looks quite strong, getting in defensive mode after each attack. That also means that you could use the racial trait for Bulwark, maybe. That means that your defensive stance is worth even more. Getting a bunch of Earthshakers. Now, they aren't optional cavalry, so they would be quite slow. That is something to keep in mind. You would probably want athletics if you're focusing on Earthbreakers. Otherwise, you're going to have a 32 speed melee unit that gets shot to pieces at range the whole time. That you wouldn't want that. That would be no good, right? But overall, it looks like a very, very, very tanky unit. Early game shock units are good because early game shield units are good. It's not until the mid game that shield units fall off a cliff. So preemptively countering shield units really hard with a unit like this, and doing it with a unit that's potentially tankier than a shield unit is pretty interesting. Shademaker is not, I mean, he's an archer, he's tier 2. It's not an optional cavalry. It does do decent elemental damage. Incarnate shot doing that AoE debuff also looks pretty interesting, I can say. Overall, though, it's not, I'm not wowed by it. This one I'm wowed by. This one I think is just a really nifty, efficient unit. The Shademaker, especially tier 2, is the worst tier to try to focus for. It's not doing it for me. The Guardian is also not doing it for me. I get where it's going for. I get what it's doing. It's just that damage is so low. Like, I just feel like enemies are just going to ignore him outright. And his stats aren't really that impressive to begin with. And I'm not too fond of shield units anyway. The Architect looks interesting. I have to see all these stats, obviously. But having a unit that gives Giga Heals and a summon, I mean a Giga Heal and a summon, that looks very strong from the Architect. That looks quite usable. I mean, to say the least, those are quite usable. I definitely can see some builds focused on Architects. Maybe not, you know, like 5 Architects in a stack, but maybe. I mean, this looks pretty strong, but especially that Conjure. Depends on what its Conjure scales off of as well. Like, will it get enchantments? Will it get anything, right? Like, I don't know what it'll get, right? And the Giga Heal in combination with the Giga Summon, maybe you do like 4 Architects and then you just slap maybe 1 shield unit down in the early game. Like, oh, I shouldn't say the early game, for the mid game. You know, before you start going to tier 4 units, so maybe just have like 1 Guardian run up and debuff every enemy's resistance, and then just generally be a pain, and then you just chuck some Architects conjuring down their summon, shooting enemies, because this is pretty good damage as well. And then if they ever try to focus the shield unit, you just heal it, although it'll probably die in 1 turn. But you get the idea, right? This unit looks very interesting. Very, very, very interesting. So I think that's a good idea. I also am really interested with the summon. That could definitely open up some things, especially because they're adding 4 new tomes in this expansion. So that'll be very interesting as to where we go with that one, right? So overall, Architects, this, yeah, looks interesting. Definitely looks interesting. I'm just not I'm not sold on some of these units. This one I'm definitely sold on. This one I'm definitely sold on. It's just their tier 2. Their tier 2 lineup looks weak, but their tier 1 and their tier 3 lineup looks absolutely, well, good. Really, really good. The entire culture looks really, really good. Overpowered, I haven't seen anything breaking my brain yet. Oathsworn is a very, very strong culture too, and Oathsworn has, let's say, some very strong similarities stat-wise here. The only thing that looks really that out of line is the Earthbreaker, but again, I don't like looking at screenshots and just deducing from the screenshot, because this could be anything, right? I don't think there's a world where a tier 1 shark unit would have 85 base HP, because it does look like, I can tell this is an orc. Shocking, you know, that I can tell it's an orc. I mean, really, truly, I would know that. And so that's going to have 8 more HP based on just its racial trait. So it would have 85 HP. 85 HP would be a lot. That would be a lot. Especially for tier 1 unit. Especially for potentially early in the game. They also said that this is, it does low damage, but 19 damage would not be low for a tier 1 shark unit, right? So I definitely think this is more of like a mid-game look on it. I think they use more of like a mid-game screenshot for this. Certainly I can tell it's already leveled up, so actually that'd be 75 HP. Yes, see, so 75 HP, that's looking way more reasonable for a tier 1 unit. So we'll see. We'll see what happens with this. I wouldn't put too much stock into this. I know a lot of guys like to look at you know, early access screenshots and, oh my god, look at this, right? Like, I don't the devs, a lot of times they're not really intending these to be analyzed that much, and really when you look at it, this isn't really that out of line, but it does look quite strong. So that's the Architects. Make sure to like, make sure to subscribe, make sure to leave a comment down below, tell me your thoughts. Does it look good? I think you guys will like and dislike the same things I like and dislike. It seems kind of obvious, right? So if you disagree with me, make sure to just tell me why, because I'd be interested to know, do you think the Guardian looks really cool? I mean, obviously he looks really cool. I mean, he does look really cool. I just think that low damage is off-putting to me. But thank you all for watching. Thank you all for being here. Like, subscribe, and as always, have a great rest of your day.